Welcome, everyone, to the 16th episode of Thinking Out Loud. We're still trying to figure out how to have the best audio possible, so apologies for it not being perfect. Today we're joined by James Lindsay. He's published a book titled How to Have Impossible Conversations, and is one of the people behind the Grievance Studies hoax. We're also joined by Sarah, an ex-member of Antifa. We have a very fruitful conversation. It was a pleasure to have both of them on the podcast. Both Bruce and Sarah prefer not to have their faces shown yet, so you'll only get to see James and I. Anyways, hope you enjoy the video. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I am your host, Vincent Freeman, and today is a bit of an unorthodox episode where generally it's 2 to 3 people in a podcast. Now we have a whole 4 people. So I'm joined here first by my friend Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast once more.
As always, thanks for having us, and I'm really excited for today.
Yeah, and we're joined by a returning guest. He is our third returning guest for this podcast. As you may remember, Colin Wright joined us again recently, as did Shittiest Disciple, and now we have James Lindsay back on. James, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And we are joined by a first, someone by the name of Sarah, who was originally not just an ex-SJW, but she was also in Antifa. So I think we can have a very fruitful conversation here with Sarah. Sarah, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. It's going to be a lot of fun.
So today I want to explore the mentality of Antifa and try to steelman their arguments as much as possible. So I think we're going to be able to have an interesting conversation there, see what exactly it is that goes through the psyche of Antifa. But I also sort of want to highlight the new website that it was launched by James recently called New Discourses. So James, would you mind giving a quick rundown of New Discourses and what it is?
Yeah, New Discourses is a platform that I've started, and most people who go there are going to figure out pretty quickly that the main thing that I'm talking about is this so-called critical social justice movement, whether you want to call it that or intersectionality or wokeness or whatever name you want to give it, social justice movement, social justice warriors. Its scope is actually broader than that, but it's overwhelmingly what I focus on right now, both because it's a huge problem and because my expertise and effectiveness lie there. But generally, the purpose of New Discourses is to look at things that are constraining our ability to have open and honest discourse and to provide educational resources so people can kind of navigate around those and have kind of force productive discourse into the open, because things can't hide behind strange uses of language or strange meanings of terms or strange ideologies where you say one thing and you mean something kind of different. The main thing I'm doing on there that probably has the most importance right now, I mean, I'm doing articles, there's video, there's podcasts, there's a bunch of stuff, but the main thing is that I'm building an encyclopedia of critical social justice terminology that I call translations from the wokish. So they are rather famous for using terminology in very specific ways. That includes, academic jargon like epistemic friction or privilege preserving epistemic pushback. That includes concepts of philosophy like postmodernism or epistem would be an idea from Michel Foucault, the very specific what neo-Marxism is and so on and so forth. And then they also are very famous for using terminology that we are all familiar with, and this I think will be very relevant in our discussion because Antifa does this as well, such as racist or sexist or in this case fascist, in ways that the public doesn't quite recognize, but they carry all of that like moral reaction that you get to those terms, even though they mean something different by them. And so I decided to start trying to clarify that discourse, as the formal term would be, to show how they use language, how the terms relate to one another, how it actually constructs an entire worldview and that they operate from. And so that's the main project that I'm working on now, is to flesh out that encyclopedia and fill it in as much as I can. In fact, relevant to what we're talking about today, this afternoon, I drafted the entry, which is not published yet, obviously, but I did the first draft of the entry for tolerance. And tolerance is understood in the Marcusean way of repressive tolerance. And this is actually central to the Antifa project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess in order to catalyst this conversation, we should sort of get a general synopsis of Sarah's story in Antifa. So Sarah, would you mind just quickly giving or however long you want it to make. Your story with the stuff that you want to highlight.
Yeah. Okay. So I will keep it brief, and then if you want more details about specific things, just let me know. So I think the easiest way to trace it back, simplistically, would be the election of Donald Trump. And this tracks with the general recent rise of Antifa, really began in earnest in 2016. And then, so that's when I first began to feel this real sense of existential threat, right, from the rise of certain political movements. And I felt threatened to the degree that I didn't feel like more establishment groups were actually doing what it took to stop the progression of certain far-right, alt-right ideologies. And what really set me off, though, I would say, would be around April to June of 2018, when the humanitarian crisis of the family separation at the southern border really first began to be exposed. And that really deeply affected me because I had studied psychology, and in particular developmental and child psychology. And so I knew exactly what that was doing to the brains of those children. And I couldn't tolerate it. And I didn't understand why the whole country wasn't freaking out, and why everyone wasn't doing whatever it took to put an end to what was happening there. And so, having nowhere else to put that energy, I went for the people who seemed to be taking the most drastic and serious action about it. And, who else would that be? But, your local anti-fascists. And fortunately, or unfortunately for me, there is a very large presence of that where I live: anarchist bookstores, co-ops, communal businesses, warehouse communes, you name it, we got it. And so there was a lot of different areas where I could direct that energy. And yeah, that's basically how I got involved.
And what prompted you to want to leave it? What was the catalyzing enzyme of maybe this isn't the best place to be?
Mm. It was gradual. It was very gradual. And it began with just these little criticisms and these little doubts that I had tried to extinguish within myself for a really long time. Doubts and criticisms that I had not allowed to exist within myself because it was believed that those are only a function of my inherently oppressive identity as a white woman. Right. So I have no place to even be having these doubts, right? That is a function of this racist identity that I've been taught to have, etc. And then began to notice how my inherently very nurturing nature was suddenly becoming hardened, and I wasn't allowed to have empathy for people, based on any given number of so-called oppressive positionalities that they hold. And I saw people purposefully and willfully manipulate and misuse people on the basis that it was okay because they held certain identity positions over them. And I didn't like that. It was wrong. And I had to slowly distance myself from a lot of my previous community just to get some space to breathe. And after some time of kind of just isolating myself and basically stopping self-indoctrination, I went back to revisit some like previous literature or pamphlets or materials that they were giving out, and it felt like there were like these, it was like old wheels in my head trying to turn again. I could no longer understand this heavy use of loaded language that they used. And that's when I realized that this isn't a normal type of group. And it allowed me to start looking at different opinions again and critical opinions. And where Lindsay's work comes in is I realized how flawed my epistemology was. The method that with which I was getting to these conclusions that led me to this group was just like flawed, not necessarily based in reality, mostly emotionally driven, heavily dependent on a crowd mentality. Yeah, a lot of stuff like that.
Wow, that's some pretty harrowing stuff. And James, I want to ask you, um, you know, the general idea on the periphery of the situation when you think of Antifa, you think, well, it's anti-fascist. How could that possibly be any wrong? But there clearly must be something wrong with that, right? So is the only thing that's wrong with Antifa the fact that they engage in violent tactics? Is that really effectively it? Or as Sarah says, is there also a problem with flawed epistemology and how they integrate intersectionality into their ideology? Overall, what's the general problem with Antifa aside from the fact that they're violent?
I mean, if you asked me what it was, I would tell you that their definition of fascism is bullshit. That's the
Yes.
core of everything. It's like, is there a bigger problem? It's, yeah, okay, you're anti-fascist, and if we actually genuinely had fascism to be standing up to, there's a totally sane and even possibly socially responsible argument to be made for that. But with your definition of fascism, as Sarah said, the rise of Donald Trump. I've said this like a bajillion times in the past 3.5 years. It's like Donald Trump is the irritant that's driving the social justice movement absolutely crazy. It is radicalizing people to the left so far and hard. Part of that is the narrative that the left is pushing out. So there's a feedback loop happening. And part of that is that theory actually kind of predicts the rise of this kind of boorish, anti-establishment, maybe kind of sympathetic to, it's hard to tell what his real loyalties are, but sympathetic to dictators and strongmen. This kind of and then you start tacking on, I've tried to avoid racist, sexist, misogynist, and so on, but those things are obviously central to the narrative from the left. Theory actually explains, it says that society actually is fundamentally racist, fundamentally sexist, fundamentally ableist, heteronormative. You pick your favorite problematic. It's inherently that, and merely hiding it. And eventually, and this is a phrase that I would tell you, and I would tell you that this very, very plainly, I should tell you, if you hear this from the left, if you hear this from the right, if you hear this from the center, if somebody says the mask is coming off, they're probably dipped into critical methods. They believe that people are thinking very differently than they actually present, and eventually the mask slips or the mask comes off, or we have to unmask this. So when Donald Trump started to rise to popularity, this was interpreted through people who are progressive, who have taken on a fair amount of theory, as the mask of racism, the mask of sexism, or in the case of Antifa, the mask of fascism. And these things, of course, being intertwined. They're all sort of the same thing from that perspective.
100%.
They're different. Yeah, they're different facets of exactly the same thing, which is oppression versus oppressor. And what his rise was interpreted by this theory as the mask that most of America is wearing slipping. So America was revealing in their willingness to elect Trump that they actually do prefer to have a society that's based in racism. They actually do prefer to have a society based in sexism. They prefer one that's misogynistic, or you can grab them by the you know what, and they let you do it because you're famous. They prefer a society that doesn't care about disabled people or fat people, or that makes fun of them, that's anti-gay, despite the fact that technically Donald Trump's the first president that, when elected openly, was in support of gay marriage. They also would see this as a movement which has been characterized, not wholly wrongly, but partly by exaggerating stuff from Hannah Arendt over the course of the last 10 years, as inherently fascist rising up. Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, and that your complicity by not fighting actively against it actually is how evil or how fascism takes root. And there were these memes that went around for a decade before Trump even came on the scene in a realistic way, saying that, fascism has these like 14 qualities, and the GOP basically satisfies 13 out of the 14 already, or all 14 of them already. It's fascism. It's fascism. There were all these people saying, I forget who the quote is attributed to, maybe one of you know, that when fascism comes to America, it'll be carrying a flag and holding a cross. And then, the images of Sarah Palin wrapping herself literally in a flag and holding a cross and a gun or something like that, just going everywhere. And so that view that actually is a vindication of hidden secret forces of evil, specifically racism, sexism, you name it, ism or phobia, plus fascism, that whole mindset is how Antifa exploded. And it's also, you cannot avoid the relevance of the rise of Donald Trump. And the fact is, as Sarah also mentioned, this feeling of existential dread or panic. The fact that politics have become existential, and I will say not just for most of people on the left, but also for most of people on the right. And so everybody's freaking out. So as far as with Antifa, if we were talking about the genuine rise of fascism and not, even over-interpreting, worrying symptoms from the White House as it is, if we were talking about the genuine rise of fascism, where the state starts to openly be complicit, as you mentioned, the detention centers on the southern border, the state starts to be openly complicit. And so who are you going to turn to, if say, mm-hmm. If, say, the alt-right roll up and they are causing, white supremacist violence, or the Klan breaks out, and you call the cops, and the cops are in on with the Klan, what are you going to do? You have no other option but to go kind of extra legal or whatever. And so because there's this underlying interpretation of these weird, I will say magical systemic forces that everything operates from in this entire worldview, there's this definition of fascism, if you want, but it is this over-determination of what fascism is, of what racism is, what sexism is, that caused people to just go freaking berserk. Racism actually preceded Trump, by the way. It really exploded onto the scene, particularly with Black Lives Matter, which followed the Ferguson police shooting and Trayvon Martin murder, I'll say murder, in Florida. From a few years before. The sexism stuff exploded with the college rape culture business. The Dear Colleague letter was weaponized, and Title IX was weaponized by our friend Joe Biden to do that. So you start to get this this image that, you have different sectors of the, I'll say, progressive left becoming the radical progressive left, as they started to see various crises. So you had sexism with the rape culture thing, you had racism with the systemic racism with the Black Lives Matter movement. You had this fear of all of that plus fascism, as you have Trump coming up and saying, no, I think Putin's great. No, I think, Kim Jong-un is great. He's even tweeting about that now. Like, I'm pretty sure that's probably
crazy.
So fake. It's like, did he just fall for like North Korean propaganda, or what's going on here? I now actually kind of can understand all of that, because the thing is the part of the reason that Trump is so inflammatory to the left, is the far left, I should say, or radical left, is not just because he is breaking norms and stuff, but specifically because he's doing it in the same manner. It's the same critical method. It's the same deconstructive approach. And so it's outside of those establishment rules So it's extra inflammatory. But so Antifa is deciding to be vigilante, which is already bad, but except in extreme circumstances that aren't as extreme as they're doing, but B, they're doing so based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality that's rooted in this critical theoretical method that sees systems of power as being the primary determinant of social outcomes and political outcomes.
Well, what I find very, very unusual through this is like, James, have you met Greg Lukianoff or James or Jonathan Haidt? And I'm assuming you've read their book, Coddling of the American Mind.
I have read the book, and I read their essay when it first came out, and I followed John's work in particular, at least back to 2011 or so. But I read the Happiness Hypothesis before the Righteous Mind ever even came out. I read the Righteous Mind when it came out. I have spoken with John a few times. I shouldn't say a number of times. And I am friendly-ish with Greg, but I haven't met either one of them in person, and I haven't spoken directly to Greg. But I'm in the orbit at this point.
What I thought was unusual when you described all of that is like in their book they talk about how the proliferation of safe spaces, trigger warnings, and all that material is really leading into all of this. And one of the things that Greg learned in his exploration of cognitive behavioral therapy is like you need to be exposed to uncomfortable ideas and truths in order to truly get over certain deleterious points of view. And it just seems to me that the people who ascribe to social justice, to quote unquote critical social justice ideologies, and especially the Antifa, is that they are seeing confirmation bias in what Trump is doing. I mean, like
exactly.
Ben Shapiro made a statement: "Don't attribute to malevolence what you could attribute to stupidity."
Right.
I can argue that Trump is both, but I mostly tend to believe he leans more towards the stupid than malevolent. Although there's a little bit of both, obviously. But
sure.
What I see to be somewhat disingenuous, definitely to be disingenuous on Antifa's part, is that they seem to be ignoring stats that state that people who voted for Obama twice voted for Trump, as their concerns were just being overlooked. They overlooked the idea like a liberal Muslim by the name of Azra Nomani voted for Trump as she didn't feel like Islamic extremism was being taken seriously. And they seem to be just overlooking the idea that Asian Americans themselves are being discriminated at Harvard, and which because of how Asians typically perform academically, because of cultural demands, and it just from that the term quote unquote white adjacent came into play, and it just seems to be just this ideology that is taking objective fact and applying a very, very healthy dose of postmodernism to the whole thing, to wrap it around something just to fit a very, very to fit a.
I want to disagree with something really quickly. I don't think it's overlooking. I think it is believing that they are class and race traitors. Right. Literally, I've heard that language used.
Exactly. Matters of fact.
It's not just like a misunderstanding. It's like, no, you have bought into this system and you also need to be fought because you bought into this system. You sold your soul.
Yep. And
that's why the minority within the minority receives almost 10 times vitriol.
Yep. So it's very important to understand that all of this is rooted in, you mentioned postmodernism, Bruce, but it's relevant both in postmodern criticism and in critical theory more specifically. And that I hate to put it this way because the critical theorists tried to be a little bit more intellectual and careful about this, but matters of fact, matters of falsity utterly miss the point. It's not that they don't believe necessarily in true things and false things. The critical theorists definitely believed in true things and false things. Postmodernists got a little weirder about true and false. However, the point is that true and false miss the point. The point is that there are systems of power in play. So you can't look at matters of fact. If you look at matters of fact, you're just trying to distract. You're just trying to spin a narrative that upholds the systems of power. And it's the systems of power that actually matter. Individuals, actual factual matters. So they do a study, for example, this actually happened in Texas, finding out that there was no detectable racial motivation in police use of lethal force. And the result was that study has to be retracted. The people who did it have to lose their PhDs. This all has to be destroyed from the academic record because those matters of fact can be used to uphold systems of power. So when you have people who voted for Obama twice and then they vote for Trump, the mask slipped. They always had that desire to hold the oppressive system up, and the mask finally slipped. Or, as Sarah pointed out, they saw the opportunity to buy in cynically to something for their own selfish motivation. So there's false consciousness, and then there's cynical self-interest. Those are both, and they don't really try to distinguish between them because it's useful not to. You can accuse people of being stupid and malevolent at the same time, and then bounce back and forth between them and attack them over the malevolence whenever you feel like doing so. And so it's a very topsy-turvy world where truth and fact don't actually matter. All that matters, and this is the heart of these critical approaches, is the application of power and the way that systems of power operate and in fact create oppression. The moral imperative at the heart of these theories is that oppression, you must have liberation from oppression. That's why you see liberationism. That's why you hear them talking about liberate. That's why you hear them talk about emancipate all the time. You're trying to liberate and emancipate people from oppression. So if somebody, whether they be a racial minority, whether they be a woman, whether they be whatever it happens to be, it doesn't matter. Whether they happen to be progressive, who this theory hates probably the most, because they're the most traitorous. If they speak into or fail to speak out against or actually attack the status quo and anything that can be, not even anything that does support the status quo, but anything that can be construed to support the status quo, then they are complicit in that oppression. They are evil. And so the fact is utterly irrelevant. It's whether or not the idea itself speaks into a powerful discourse or whether it supports an elite ideology that's a hegemonic force over society. So when you look at reasons that people actually voted for Trump, it doesn't matter to them. All that matters is that they supported somebody who is aligned with racism, sexism, fascism, heteronormativity, ableism. You mocked the disabled guy. That's your ableism right there. I mean, it's just, you go right down the list, and they see this as, if you supported him, you were so blind to how he supports oppression, or you were so cynically self-interested because you bought into the idea of oppression benefiting you, that you actually are a part of the problem that needs to be destroyed. It doesn't matter what the real reasons are. It's very difficult to communicate this because when you're not in that line of thought, like you said with the wheels, right? With the old wheels, you couldn't make turn anymore. When you're not in that line of thought, you're like, they can't possibly think that way. Nobody can possibly think that way. But they do. And you said indoctrination and self-indoctrination. I've actually almost got to the point where I won't call it an indoctrination anymore. It's a reprogramming. It is a programming to think in a particular way about things, and that way it's called critical. Reform. Yeah, exactly.
On that point of the whole mask off thing, there's literally a saying where it's like, their mask is off, we mask up.
Yep. I hear it all the time. Yeah. The mask slipped, the mask is off, the mask is finally off. Donald Trump said this thing that if you really contort the way he said it, that proves that he has huge racial animus. And then if you start tying it to all the historical oppression of the country, and that sets a context in which he said it, and you start setting it against whether or not his father screwed over black people in some rent thing, it doesn't really matter what the facts are. It's just about constructing the narrative that he's speaking from a place that's consistent with this system of oppression, and that he's bought into it. And so anybody who supports him is complicit in that, and they show it for real. It was just so bad with what happened too. It's like, once you learn theory, you're like, oh my gosh, because what was the big thing in 2016 they all talked about? They were like, all these conservatives didn't put out Trump signs. They didn't tell anybody they were going to vote for Trump. And then they silently went to the ballot box, and all the polls were wrong because they lied to the pollsters, and they went and they voted for Trump. They had their mask fixed on, and then boom, the second it mattered, they took it off. And now we have fascism, and that's how fascism worked, and da-da-da-da-da. And it's really a fascinating worldview to kind of have inside-outsider perspective on. but from the outside, it's properly fucking crazy, and you can't actually understand it.
Yeah. It's funny because Steven Pinker
It's
talks
such a
about how
mind fuck. You guys have no idea.
it's
I
funny
see
because
it all
Steven
the
Pinker.
time. Go ahead with Steven Pinker.
Oh yeah,
So
sorry. I was just gonna say it's funny because Steven Pinker talks about how a lot of people, intellectuals in particular, seem to hate the idea of progress. So when you look at the general documentation of attitudes towards minorities, towards homosexuals, towards liberal rights or civil rights, the general attitude as time progresses tends to make a positive liberal trend, right? So more and more people are accepting of gay people, more and more
right.
people are less racist, and you can document this. And it, and yet for some reason Antifa and the far left and certain intellectuals seem to hate this idea, almost as if on a religious doctrine they make the claim that all of this is just nonsense and we're looking at it through the wrong lens. And so it really is a problem when there are genuine statistics out there, genuine studies out there, by the likes of like Dr. Davidio that show that look, bias is genuinely like real. That there is people are there is a genuine phenomenon of bias in people, but the problem is nowhere near as pronounced as they're claiming that it is. And so they have to like amplify all of this in order for it to fit their narrative. So do you think the reasoning behind this, yeah, I'll go ahead. Do you think the reasoning behind this is that there seems to be some sort of religious aspect to Antifa, to this ideology, that they have to base their views, their beliefs on things that just aren't backed up by data?
Well, I have a quick thought.
Yes.
Not on the religious aspect of it, but all those studies don't mean jack shit. It's about someone's lived experience.
That's right.
That's what matters.
That's right.
And a quote by Andrew Doyle that screwed me over when I was starting to come out of this, or just my mind was like, oh, what was his quote? He said, lived experience, that's what we used to call anecdotal evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh my God, he's right.
And it's not even lived experience, because lived experience is only authentic if it goes through theory. So all that stuff you just said, guess what? It supports a narrative that supports the status quo. It's not radical or revolutionary. It is evil. It's not even like wrong. It's evil. Right and wrong don't matter. All that matters is whether or not it can be used to support the status quo. And so you just gave this whole thing, oh, history bends toward progress, and we have all these statistics that show that things are better than they used to be. Well, that means we don't need to be as revolutionary as we used to be. That supports the status quo. Evil. And that's why they hate Steven Pinker. I mean, that's literally why they call it Pinkerian optimism, and they just trash him for Pinkerian optimism because they say that it's just yet another way for the status quo to assert itself. Oh, no, we can chill out. We don't have to be radical anymore. We don't have to be revolutionary anymore. We don't have to go full tilt anymore. We are making progress, and there's proof. That is a narrative that supports the oppressor. It allows the oppressors that still exist to continue oppressing.
And it's counter to their narrative that the only thing that we should be working towards is perpetual revolution and decolonization. There is no end goal. It is a permanent project.
As the famous critical pedagogist, the father or grandfather, I guess, of critical pedagogy, Paulo Freire, wrote, for a revolution to be authentic, it must be perpetual. For the second it stops being revolutionary, it is the status quo. It must be perpetual. And as you said, people ask me all the time, what's the end goal? There's not one. The end goal is constant ability to make power grabs. That's it. The end goal is constant ability to forward the politics and power of the people who are trying to claim oppressor status so they can claim power and push their politics. That's it. The end game is they get to set the rules and continue to just try to overturn anything that exists. That's why when you see them institute, say, a system in the schools for equity, and the system doesn't work, they don't say, oh, no, the equity system made grades worse. Their test scores went down. They say the system itself they say equity worked and we need more equity now. Why? Because the school itself, they might spin a narrative. They might just say that, obviously something's bad and that means that the system failed and the system's entrenched and we have to disrupt the system more. But a more sophisticated argument that I actually saw at one point was that the school itself was so racist that once they introduced an anti-racist equity program and the students became less racist, but the test itself stayed racist. Therefore, test scores went down because less racist students were forced to take a still racist test. And the answer is, let's just get rid of tests because tests are inherently racist. And it doesn't even like I keep saying, it doesn't have to make sense. The whole thing is that whatever the existing system is the problem because it's the system and it needs to be torn down. And if they cook the book such that if the system is actually theirs, the reason it failed is because hegemonic power made it fail.
Yes, and I feel like people don't believe you when you say that, but I'm
I
he's
literally
right.
get told I'm crazy like 1,000 times a month for just quoting their literature on this stuff.
Yeah. To answer Vince's question about the religious aspect of it, so it's complicated. So obviously, I mean, and I think it should be stated that Antifa itself is not a coherent political ideology. So even tracing back its history can be difficult. I think it's maybe more accurate to call it a tactic.
Beautiful trouble.
Yeah, and so there is, a million thoughts terminating cliches. One of them, and diatribe slogans, one of them very famous is, of course, no gods, no masters. So there is supposed to be this idea of no overarching authority, right? And that includes into the realm of theology. However, it's interesting that nowadays with this push for decolonization, indigenous identities are now excluded from this. So they're like, oh, no, they get special treatment because we would be replicating, colonizing powers by saying that they need to get rid of their theological beliefs, so they get special treatment.
I love this stuff.
But in terms of, I think what Vince is getting at in terms of is there a religious aspect to Antifa, I think you're getting at James's work on the postmodern, what's that word? I have it right here.
Postmodern religion and the faith of social justice.
Yes, exactly.
Or I said it backwards, actually. It's postmodern faith and the religion of social justice, I think.
No, you got it right. It was postmodern.
Oh, did I? Okay, good.
Anyways, so I think that's what more you're speaking of, is this kind of this secular religion that's almost been created. And in that area, I think you're right. As someone who's experienced this, you do have this sense of attaining a sort of secret knowledge, almost an occult standing of like you've been let in to understanding this. Yeah, you've been let in to seeing the matrix of domination and oppression. And yeah, you can see it now. You can see it for what it is, and you see it everywhere. And alongside that goes this feeling of this self-righteous zeal. Like, just speaking from personal experience, it is incredibly thrilling and validating to have this, a great pleasure in your conviction. So in that sense, I do think there is almost a religious aspect to it.
Yeah, I've actually had this conversation at length with somebody who's researching Antifa right now the other day, and I was trying to tell him that social justice and Antifa are, they have like threads together, and they are subject to one another. So, for instance, Antifa has to be much more intersectional than it used to be. It can't be purely anarchist. But in the last calculation, Antifa is anarchist, no gods, no masters, whereas social justice is more of a faith that sees power dynamics everywhere. So it doesn't. I can't actually stretch the religious metaphor or the religious analogy to Antifa very well. I see it as a form of anarchist activism primarily that's taken up with certain doctrines, some of which are deeply informed by social justice. The other thing is that Antifa is actually much less postmodern in its orientation. It has to be now. Everything has to be now. But it's much less postmodern and much more strictly critical in its orientation than is social justice as a movement. Social justice is very, very concerned with, the discourses and the effect of the discourses, and that power dynamics take on this very, like I said, almost ethereal or numinous status. They are the demons of an odd faith. Whereas the critical method was much more critical, actually, not of the way that power. So it's a postmodern idea that power flows through individuals by means of discourses and how knowledge is produced. It is not a critical, specifically idea. The critical idea was much more concerned with how the elite in society, whatever those classes of elite people are, intertwine themselves with the state to enforce state power and to create fascism. It's specifically to create states in which the Marxist revolution can never occur, and like all of this other crazy stuff, which is what neo-Marxism was about in the first place. But they're much more concerned with how the elite in society intentionally perpetuate ideologies that then get intertwined with the state. So they're much more interested in state power, where postmodernists are much more interested in power via knowledge. They're two actually very separate traditions. And like I was saying a little bit ago, I was reading Repressive Tolerance, which is an essay by Herbert Marcuse earlier today. And Herbert Marcuse was the father of, he was a critical theorist in the Frankfurt School in the post-war version of it. He was mostly centered, therefore, at Columbia University. He is considered to be the father of the New Left. The New Left was this new radical left movement that erupted following World War II, but especially into the mid and late 1960s. Its main, the New Left, there's actually a New Left versus like neoliberal old left, and then you have this old right versus neoconservative dichotomy, and they both split at the same time around actually whether or not the United States and the Western powers should intervene in Vietnam. So the Vietnam War in 1968 became very relevant in all of this. Repressive Tolerance was republished in a book in 1969. I forget exactly when it was written, but it was right in that same era, around 1968 is the date. Certainly Marcuse added an important postscript to Repressive Tolerance in 1968. All around, it's all has to do with this. So they're very interested in particular in state power and in the way that state gets corrupted. And Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance is literally saying that the state will tend toward allowing fascist and violent ideologies if they're allowed to grow. So we have to shift tolerance to be intolerant of anything that can possibly do that. So the New Left, and so that means including the use of violence to stop it. Marcuse actually observes in that essay that violence, he doesn't phrase it in the kind of more modern parlance I'm going to use now, but violence plus systemic power does way more harm than violence without systemic power or against systemic power, which for any harm that it causes, and he says they are both evil explicitly in the essay, but it actually can end up causing net good. And so the Marcuse spawned largely off of this particular essay, Repressive Tolerance, that being kind of their core thing, became black liberationism in the United States. It became black feminism. It became radical feminism. It became the Black Panthers. It became Black Power movement, eventually black nationalism, and then thus black Hebrew nationalism, which is even further out in the boonies. In South America, it turned into liberation theology, which was mostly taken up by post-Marxists in the Catholic Church and neo-Marxists in the Catholic Church. That's where Paulo Freire ended up picking up a lot of it, more than likely. In Europe, because of the unique context of that's where the Nazis actually were, it mostly took off. The European New Left was primarily Antifa. And Antifa in Europe is a much more serious operation than it is in the United States by any stretch of the imagination. And it's much more active, and it traces directly back to Marcuse. In the United States, it's a little bit blurrier. Like Sarah said, it didn't really, it's all this kind of like fuzzy thing where there was some literature and there were some, anarchist dudes off on the fringes that occasionally did a thing here and there where the Klan would show up or something. And then 2016 happened, and all of a sudden Antifa is like out in regular cities, and especially across the western seaboard, but also a little bit across eastern seaboard. Not so much in like Nebraska or where I live in Tennessee. Tennessee actually passed a law saying that if they were protesting in the streets here, you could hit them with your car. So they would see, yep, you want to block traffic in Tennessee? Good luck, hee-haw.
Holy crap.
The Tennessee legislature got blasted for this by progressives too, saying that it was proof that they were all about maintaining the status quo and suppressing. The state is now suppressing, radical protest and all of this, because it was if they're blocking traffic specifically, it's like you can't drive up on the sidewalk and hit somebody, but if they're blocking traffic, beep beep, get out of the way because you can hit them with your car. So it's more prominent in certain places than others, but certainly the idea there is that this radical leftist movement that came out of the idea of repressive tolerance, and that's really what Antifa is about. If you wanted to boil it down to a core axiom, is repressive tolerance. That which can lead to fascist ideologies taking root must be stamped out, and it's not really a religious perspective, and by any means necessary, really.
Oh man, that's a huge group here. That's the name of an actual group. By any means necessary.
Yeah, what a big surprise.
Yeah, and they are some of the, even other Antifa groups think that they've lost their mind.
Just wait until they try out some of those means on people, like in Tennessee, where they can, run over you with their car or pull out that AR-15 and just start. I mean, you show up in your mask, and your mask does not block bullets, as the Boxer Rebellion taught many a Chinese person over 100 years ago. Was that racist?
I don't know. Bruce, was that racist?
That was not.
Do you guys? Well, I mean, I'm the one who, I don't know. Maybe one of you guys does kung fu too, but that was the belief with the Boxer Rebellion. That's what the Boxers were. Is they thought their chi would prevent bullets from. That didn't work.
Just a complete aside right now. We were talking before this podcast, James, about how a lot of Chinese martial artists in China right now are having their beliefs challenged in a serious way with the introduction of MMA into the picture. And the results are very similar, if not as lethal, as the Boxer Rebellion.
Yeah.
Going on to what you said about how pernicious Antifa is. I know in Portland they're getting implicit support by Mayor Ted Wheeler.
Yes.
Just letting them do whatever they want. But we talked previously about how widespread it is and how insidious it is in the last time you were on. I go on Twitter sometimes and just see how get some takes from some very, very interesting people. And someone who I occasionally reference on Twitter, who runs Liberal Not Lefty, she goes by Amanda Ellen. Don't quote me on this, but from what I remember, I think she said that. Just to get her off the hook here, I don't want to misrepresent her views. Wokeness, Antifa, and the radical left don't really seem to be all that popular, even among the left. And I'm starting to give some kind of credence to that, given that well, we see the direction in which the election is going, and it seemed like Bernie Sanders was going to be our candidate, but right now Joe Biden has overtaken him, and some of the rationale that could be used to describe that is that wokeness is just taken center stage on his side. People see people like Linda Sarsour, people see the squad like Alessandro Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, the kind of ideologies they represent, like the anti-Semitism that's perpetuated by Ilhan Omar, and she hides it behind her minority status. That would seem to indicate that people are waking up to this, and wokeness is is perhaps starting to be looked upon with a much more, if you'll excuse the expression, much more critical eye by genuine liberals. What's your take on that?
Mine is that they've more or less lost the grassroots completely through their antics over the last couple of years just being so extreme. That said, they're very effectively, I will say, colonizing most of our institutions. As far as support for something like Antifa or even social justice, which has got higher support than Antifa across the left, it's complicated. It's actually really complicated. What you run into is a fair amount of people who, if they go and they just bust up a Starbucks, which actually can be explained pretty cogently in terms of, their claims of self-defense from violence, that Starbucks is perpetuating violence by hoarding resources that then make other people poor, and then that causes them harms and violence. So you have to self-defensively throw a rock through a Starbucks window in order to protect from that.
All tracks. Yep. That's correct.
Yeah, so that kind of behavior is not broadly popular on the left, but I run into a surprising number of people on the center left who are very much in the vein of, well, they're anti-fascist and Trump's pretty bad, so I'll turn a bit of a blind eye to them. So there's a little bit of apologism there. It's not support, but it's an unwillingness to condemn, and I see a lot even broader sympathy for beliefs about, the nature of systemic racism, systemic sexism, and so on, about the social justice aspects of these things that has even broader support. That said, the same people, I right now, I get these weird periods in time where I get emails or direct messages on Twitter or whatever, texts sent to me in huge volumes that all kind of say the same thing. And it's like these weird periods where maybe something's waking up or whatever. The new thing that's been for the last couple of months is people that are on the left who they're like, wow, social justice warriors are way too far, but why don't you, isn't systemic racism really a thing and really important and we should be looking at it? So they're all in on the sympathies around the thing, but then they see the antics of the social justice warriors and they're against it. So you have this weird sympathetic view that's quite popular, and then you have the loss of specific support at the grassroots level. And then meanwhile, like I said, they're activists. You know what they're doing? Antifa's not showing up to the school board meeting and signing up because they're anarchists, but the social justice people are. Your little equity and diversity warriors who think that equity and diversity needs to be the center of freaking everything, they're showing up to the school board meeting. You're not. They're showing up to the task force in the legislature. You're not. They're writing letters. You're not. And so a very small number of dedicated activists are able to achieve a lot of stuff institutionally. They are actually remaking the schools during this shutdown extraordinarily effectively. And everybody, because they're showing up and no one else is. Everybody else is too busy playing Candy Crush to a new level or learning something on Duolingo that's a little bit more useful, and not paying attention to the fact that activists do one thing very consistently and very well, which is show up. Now, again, social justice activists show up to administrative meetings. Antifa shows up to a brick through a Starbucks window. It's a kind of a different sort of showing up. Or they show up to every possible hint that some organization they identify as being right-wing might possibly populate. The Proud Boys put out a rumor they might show up in Portland. Antifa shows up in force. Now Proud Boys is like, we weren't really going to come, but now we have to, because Antifa's there, so we got to stand up to him. And you can see this whole weird dance between the two. So I think they have mostly lost grassroots support. They have not lost much institutional support. There are hopeful signs right now, though, because the pandemic is causing massive budget shortfalls and people are having to figure out what to cut. And it looks like there are tentative signs that social justice projects are not necessarily being given universal favoritism, as you would expect. They are still hiring vice deans for diversity. They are still hiring more diversity coordinators and so on and so forth. But the Ohio University seemed content to lay off the entire faculty of the African American Studies Department and didn't blink an eye about it. So there's some conflicting, you know what's coming next, right? Of course, from that. We know how that's going. This isn't going to be pretty. But there is something changing. I mean, we even felt it before we released our papers into the wild. We were horrified. Like, it's in 2017, we started writing it, and we're like, can you imagine what's going to happen? We're actually luckily on tape talking about it, and we actually look kind of like histrionic or paranoid fools, because we're talking about it in the context of like mid 2017 about the backlash we're going to get, how angry people are going to be at us, they're going to lose their minds on us. On camera, we're saying this stuff. And then by about, I don't know, April, May, June or so 2018, we're like, something changed. This is going to be okay. It's not going to be well received, but it's going to be okay. And then by the time we were public in October, it was like, this is actually going to work. And so there's a lot of confidence to be able to go public with it. Whereas literally 1 year before, we were sure that it was like, we might be strung up for this.
No, and you had legitimate reasons to be concerned.
Yeah, but something has been shifting all along, and it's shifted even more now to where, academics are starting to even start. That's next to ground zero for social justice in terms of being able to speak up about it being impossible. And even academics are starting to speak up about it now. So something has shifted, and is shifting, I should say. I don't think that it's broadly popular, but there is enough sympathetic. Like, I have one friend who's quite, he's a Bernie guy. So that places him as to how deep into the left he is and what kind of left he is and all of that. He's not down with social justice whatsoever. And he's 100% content that Antifa does what it does and exists. 100% content with it. Because, well, somebody needs to be against those assholes. The Klan's going to show up. Somebody else needs to show up too. So there's a lot more sympathy out there for it than there needs to be. And it's like, dude, do you realize... I tried to talk to him, and I'm like, do you realize when they say fascism that they're talking about kind of a very expansive definition of fascism? And he's like, doesn't matter. Trump's in office. Doesn't matter. And you can't even tell these people. It's like, I tried to talk to people on the right all the time. I'm like, guys, your guy you think is fighting this stuff is actually causing it to go on steroids. It's really bad. And then you tell the social justice people, it's like, hey, guys, your antics pushed a lot of people to vote for Trump who wouldn't have otherwise, and that's probably part of what got him elected. And they're like, no, we're anti-Trump, we're anti-this, it couldn't possibly have been us. And so there's a lot of weird stuff going on around that, but definitely a lot of apologism around Antifa throughout at least the Bernie degree left side of the left part of the playing field. And these are including, like I said, people who hate wokeness. My friend, in fact, told me that he would like Antifa even more if it would drop the woke bullshit, because it dips into it.
Really?
Yeah. So he's all about this. Trump is a fascist. We have to stop the GOP as all fascist. We have to get rid of the fascist GOP and the manipulations that they're putting in the state and the way they're wrecking the economy in terms of making it so that there's greater wealth disparity and it's all going to the rich and they're all cronies and blah, blah, blah. And we have to blow that up. But we don't have to, like, if they would just stop focusing on race and sex and gender and all this stupid bullshit all the time, then I could get behind it. And my friend says this stuff all the time. I got friends all over the spectrum. I got woke friends. I got not woke friends. I got super libertarian friends. I got super conservative friends. I got black friends. I got all the friends.
You see really popular guy. Jesus, yeah.
Well, I don't. They're all digital friends, though. I don't have any friends in real life left.
Oh, man, that's okay.
Well, that's because I work 17 hours a day, like literally 7 days a week, all the time. People are like, do you sleep? And I'm like, no, I just really work all the time I'm awake.
So what I got from some of what you said was like the wokeness seems to happen in gradations and degrees.
It's like a church, man. Yeah. The theologians are like that's like Robin DiAngelo's like a theologian or a prophet or something. Like they're all up in it. And then you have the professors that are teaching it that aren't necessarily the theorists, and that's like your like high-level pastors or your paraministry organizers. Then you have the regular pastors, that's like your activists, and they're going out there, or your teachers in schools who have taken in a lot of it, or whatever, they happen to be lobbyists. And then out and out and out, and eventually it's like, think about your average church, right? You got the theologians, and they know the ins and outs and everything about it, and they got the pastors, they know a whole lot about it, but they know which like 200 Bible verses exactly that they can talk about and make the Bible not sound horrifying. And then then you get down to the people at church. You got that guy, my friend, a very close friend of mine going back literally 30 plus years now, that takes notes at church still. And it's like he's really into it and he's trying to learn it, but he's definitely not up to the level of the pastor. And then you got that tier of people, and then you got those people down below that are like they don't really read the Bible, but they listen when they go to church, and they typically go, 3 weeks out of 4. And so that's your average teacher who's being forced to read Robin DiAngelo during the lockdown. By the way, that's in all their book clubs: Robin DiAngelo, Daryl Wing Sue, all of these critical race theorists. That's the book clubs. I just was contacted earlier today about a spike in Paulo Freire's books being sold in the book market to academic institutions, including high schools and colleges, which means that they're reading it in their book clubs. They're reading critical theory in their time off for the pandemic, and they're being asked to. And so then you've got below that, you have that person who goes to church most of the time. And then you have that person who basically never goes to church, but by God, he believes in Jesus and he's going to go to heaven, and he doesn't know shit about the Christianity beyond that he's a good person and he's going to heaven. So you got all these different levels of stuff, and it's the same thing with this. Not necessarily as much with Antifa. With sympathizers, sure, but with people in Antifa, they're radical anarchists. They're all in. It's like a club. But with wokeness, you have people who have imbibed a little bit of the systemic racism idea, and they're like, yeah, there's something to that. But I don't know what it is, but I'm a good person and I'm not a racist, so it's important. All the way up to people like,
yes,
Barbara Applebaum, who's writing a 300-page book in absolute painstaking detail about the slightest variations of complicity, so that she can say that all white people are complicit in racism all the time. Very broad spectrum of not sincerity, commitment. No, not that either. Depth of understanding, or if you will. It's exactly like you would see in a church, all the way down from Bubba, who believes in Jesus but doesn't know literally he thinks that the most important sentence I'm not kidding, this is a real thing, thinks the most important sentence in the Bible is God helps those who help themselves. I don't know if you know that's obviously an anti-religious statement made by Ben Franklin, as opposed to being in the Bible, which it's absolutely not. All the way up to the theologian who can tell you the finest gradation details between the ransom theory of atonement and this other theory of atonement, and why that one's a total heresy and why this one's the absolute truth, and absolutely total spectrum. And so in that soft end of people who just want to be good people, so they buy into it a little bit and then support it, that's where your sympathizers are. That's where the majority of that kind of support for the ideas would be. And that's where you see these people who are like, I'm against social justice warriors, but definitely systemic racism is important, and so we should take critical race theory and intersectionality seriously. Just like you have those people who are like, I think the Westboro Baptist Church is insane, but Christian life is absolutely important. Or, you could do the same thing with Islam, saying that blowing up a building is probably a bad idea. Throwing gays off roofs is probably a bad idea. But, nevertheless, the Quran is the absolutely inspired holy word of the one true God, Allah, that cannot be questioned and should always be revered. Total spectrum of what the belief is and what the belief means, and the depth of understanding or even caring about what the specifics of the beliefs are.
And that's where my concern is about just how widespread, quote unquote, this is, because I spoke to Sarah and Vince of a conversation I recently had. We recently did a podcast with Yasmin Mohammed, and we were talking about the problems in Islam today, and the parallels between discussing Islam and the ideology, and Muslims the people. Mm-hmm. And we're tying it into this whole quarantine situation we're finding ourselves in right now. How important it is to criticize China, the government, versus the Chinese people.
Sure.
The person I showed the podcast to is on the left. She's a liberal, and she didn't find anything in that podcast to disagree about. She recognizes that there's a difference between talking about those two ideas. One ideology versus people. But when we started talking about the ideas about how the term white privilege is being used as a catch-all rather than one certain kind of privilege that plays into other kinds of ideas that could factor into the social justice problems we have today, she doubled down a little bit. I had to constantly explain to her that like it wasn't because I don't think it wasn't because I don't think white privilege exists. It's the degree into which it's used to slap down someone who may have a certain point of view or some kind of information they want to bring to the table when it comes to the debates arguing for the justice in social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I was told in return that going after critical theory wasn't so important, given that in this person's opinion, that's social justice still really is an issue. My response to her that I didn't get a chance to get out was that the critical social justice is a corruption of the social justice movements, and it'll damage it in the long run. But what would you have to say to someone who has a more moderate view about how who does make the distinction between criticizing ideologies and people, but still buys into the almost soft wokeness of yeah.
I'll tell you, it's hard. It is hard. I've talked to lots and lots of people, and I've had very varying degrees of success, widely varying degrees of success. And I think it actually, I mean, I see my own book in the background there, How to Have Impossible Conversations, where we talk about, in chapter 7, we talk about the level of identity getting caught up in somebody's willingness to change their minds. And so when somebody's hanging their belief about themselves being a good person on accepting certain ideas, like the white privilege exists and it's a problem and it needs to be addressed, that becomes very difficult. What I have found is a very successful way to approach it, although it has, I mean, even Sarah said, you know, it was a very gradual process of things coming apart and changing your mind. What I found is that one message that has very consistently reached people who aren't all in on this stuff is that if you care, just a simple question, if you care about, you can accuse me of whatever you want. I do care about these issues myself, but you can accuse me. I don't care what you think of me. So from there, if you care about the issues, say, of racism, even if there's systemic racism, do you believe that those methods should be attended to with the most rigorous possible approaches, using science, gathering evidence, trying to understand the nuances of it, trying to design policy and program around those nuances and that scientific work? And I found that virtually every one of them, I've talked to some pissed off, like, fuck you feminists about this with regard to women's studies and gender studies, and to a person they're like, yes. Science, yes. Best possible answer, yes. Get to the truth and solve the problem, yes. Sensible policy that actually addresses it and that works, yes. Then you say, it's very difficult to do this, but if you can actually try to address for them that there is a distinct difference that's by definition from the beginning between critical approaches like critical race theory and what were originally called traditional theories that maybe would study race and racism, that there is actually a distinct difference. The critical method is not designed to understand that stuff in a rigorous way. It is designed to look for the problems, the problematics, as a matter of fact, the moral shortcomings or the ways things could be twisted. And therefore, there actually is a difference. And then from there, I've never successfully convinced anybody on my own. I can only tell them, I don't want you to believe me, just go read it. Go read the difference, and I'll point them either to the actual, texts talking about traditional and critical theory from Horkheimer in 1937. If they think that's too old and irrelevant, I ask them to read something much more contemporary and popular and influential, like Robin DiAngelo and Özlem Sensoy's Is Everyone Really Equal?, which was published originally in 2012 and then republished in 2017 on the second edition. I actually like the first edition better. It's laid out better, in my opinion, so I usually recommend they get that one if they can. I got it for $5, so you can get it cheap. You can also, I didn't say this, but it is possible to find it online and download it for $0 on something that's maybe not called Z Library. Anyway, I tell them to read that and to kind of come back. And then when they start to see that there is not just a difference, but an intentional difference, they'll come back and tell me, well, I read some of that Senso and D'Angelo book, or they don't. I read that book you said. And I see that there's some kind of a difference there. I agree with a lot of what they say. They always say that. I agree with a lot of what they say, but there's something that's off. Another one that's actually helpful to recommend to read is actually White Fragility, and then just add in this simple extra part. If you read White Fragility, when you get done, just for my own amusement, if you don't care, tell me what you think about the story she tells about when she goes to the party and she thinks she has to be with the all black group versus the not all black group. Now she gets really tense about that. And tell me what you think about that story. Just that one detail and nothing else. And it's like, I had this one woman that I did that with send me a text when she got to, she's like, I spit out my wine when I read that. It's like, the woman's a racist and she's just writing down her own racism. And I'm like, aha, now carry on and read the rest of the book and see what you think. So, drawing highlights to these things. But I mean, this is why it's such a painstaking process. Like Sarah and I were talking about, people think you're crazy. You can quote their literature and people are like, you read it wrong. Those words clearly don't mean what they actually say. You have to, it's the most frustrating and exhausting thing ever, because you have to show them example after example after example after example after example to get them to understand that there is a fundamental difference. It's getting them to agree that rigorous methods versus ones that just complain, everybody's down with that. But getting them to understand that critical race theory, for example, or critical theory about gender, or whatever it happens to be, is utterly not attempting to understand the thing it complains about and why it is the way that it is, or seek sensible policies. It's just trying to achieve radical political change. Helps them. So then you can even go into, well, look, if you believe that there is a problem with systemic racism, don't you think we should understand what the system, like what's the system? Should we understand clearly what system they're talking about? Should we understand how to influence that system? And then this question seems to work with some people too. Look at what they're doing. Does it look like it's working? Or do you see white people deciding they're going to double down and become more racist? Do you think they're just taking their mask off, or do you think they're actually being told, you're racist, you're racist, you're racist, you're racist, to the point where they finally say, you know what, screw it, I'll be racist? And those things kind of do sometimes hit a crack, but it's so tied up with somebody trying to be a good person that it's very, very, very difficult to get them to understand that there's something going on there.
And that's been my experience too, because the said individual who I was having this conversation with is a very good person, I would say. So she obviously cares about.
They almost all are.
Yeah, exactly. They're absolutely wonderful people. But when you wrap your identity around something that's seemingly benign, there is much more of an incentive to grasp on and to hold on to it. But
sure.
And being able to put forth an example or a series of examples to show them this is not a small thing by any means.
Sarah is much better placed than we are for that, because she can talk about those actual manipulations of those nice people in great detail.
I mean, yeah, it's pretty crazy.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, by the way.
No, I mean, like people, I've been in conversations where people just think it's okay to like outright scam other individuals, like straight up scam people out of their money because they are in a whole various identity categories where, according to theory, they're going to have more access to replenish that wealth anyways. So what's the harm? Mm-hmm. Right? Well, the harm is you're treating someone like shit and you're being untrustworthy, and that's going to hurt someone, and that's going to hurt their ability to form relationships going forward. And what if they then go forward and hold that against your own identity group? You know, it's no bueno.
It's no bueno. That's right. We're culturally appropriating everywhere here.
Yeah. So I'm afraid this is where the conversation is probably going to have to end because I have to go somewhere in about 30 minutes. But James, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast, as well as Sarah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your
Let me
perspective.
steal I don't want to keep you. Let me steal 3 minutes. I really want to ask
go
Sarah
for
one
it.
question while we have the chance. So we've talked obviously about Marcuse's element and influence, and I'd be interested to know if that ever came up explicitly. But a name I'm much more interested in. Maybe the answer is just simply no. But I'm very interested to find out what the relevance in your experience was around the name Frantz Fanon. It may have been pronounced Fanon, but it's Fanon. It's a French psycho. Yeah.
Yes. So, one of my previous friend of mine basically started up a collective wholly centered around his work. Yep. And the whole point was Black and Indigenous liberation. The funny thing was that no one in that group was from those categories, but they are, that was explicitly what they were working towards. And their group in particular was, I would almost say, interested in almost a de-civilization project, where undoing and just constant decolonizing. The only way to attain that is to basically take a step back in our current structure of civilization, because that's just it presupposes that is just how it operates. And so we actually need to devolve a little bit to move forward in liberation. That's how I interpret it anyways.
Sure. The relevance of Fanon, by the way, or Fanon, I should say Fanon. The relevance is that he actually wrote most of his stuff in the 50s and the early 60s. So he precedes postmodernism entirely, but he is the root that grew into post-colonial theory. And he was a French psychoanalyst. His deal was that colonization is so dehumanizing that it takes over the way people think, the way that they are, that to just have a sense of self-preservation and self-assertion, that colonized people need to rise up in violence to overthrow their colonizers on every level, including at the level of mindsets and psychology. And so he has actually been taken up rather significantly by the Antifa movement. So insofar as the limited amount of Antifa literature that I've read has indicated, I've seen his name dragged up several times, but there's actually even one book that's rather horrifying to read. I don't know if you've read it, Sarah, it's called Black Bloc, White Riot. And it is actually pretty core activist literature. It's published by an Antifa press. I forgot what press, but it's
probably
definitely
AK Press.
That is it. That is correct. AK Press. And that's a parody off, or not a parody, but it's a riff off of Fanon, one of Fanon's early post-colonialism books that was called Black Skins, White Masks, or something like that. And where it was obviously that you had people with black skin being forced to wear a white mask under colonialism. And so you get the whole mask imagery, you have, the whole freaking thing. And so that book that is in the Antifa literature in particular calls Fanon dynamite in print, and talks about the need to draw upon his revolutionary spirit to tear down the established society and so on. And that's where you start getting these sects within Antifa that would be perpetual decolonization or perpetual ripping down of the status quo. So there are, like I said, that went on to inform the post-colonial literature that now is, at the deep heart of a great, proportion of the social justice literature. So there are connections. I did wonder, getting to talk to you, if you had encountered either Marcuse or Fanon in your activist exploits, because at least at the theoretical level, they are both highly relevant.
Yeah, I just pulled up the blog of the collective, and one of their pieces is called Introduction and Decolonial Action and Thought through Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And then to piggyback on what I was just saying, another piece that they wrote is called Let's Destitute the World, an invitation to a new logic of revolutionary change.
That's equity right there. If everybody's poor, then nobody has more than anybody else. Equity.
Basically.
Achieved.
And then another one is decolonization is not a metaphor. So I get frustrated because I feel like people don't take what they're saying literally. They're like, oh, like, they're just a bunch of crazies. Like, they don't really mean what they say. I'm like, no, when they're talking about, like, firebombing school institutions, they mean what they say. Like, and I understand the urge to not want to believe it. Trust me, I get that. But, like, or not take them at face value. But they're dead serious about it.
Right. It's like I see the same thing with social justice where they say that, it's a myth that any knowledge can be objective. So all knowledge is subjective. So we need to forward lived experience, or more, maybe poignantly, it was a critical math ed person, Rochelle Gutierrez, who was talking about equity in mathematics education. It's just, we're all about equity in mathematics education, but maybe equity isn't enough. Maybe we should be talking about revolution. And it's like, take them at their word. They know what they're saying. They actually mean it.
Yeah, I'll send you this thing about Franz Fanon in the chat. Yeah, the contents, why we use violence. Recovering our dignity and humanity through decolonial action.
That's that's the Wretched of the Earth's thesis right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So this stuff has deep roots.
Yeah.
Yes.
Incredibly deep. James, it's been absolutely enlightening to have you on. Thanks for coming on the podcast once more, and we hope to see you again. You're genuinely one of the smartest people I've ever come across, and one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to social justice. It consistently blows my mind. Thanks for coming on.
Wait, plug his book.
Oh, and of course, everybody.
No, the new book.
Absolutely.
The new book.
Oh, your new book, Cynical Theories. That's right.
Yeah.
So go ahead and talk about that.
It doesn't exist yet. It will come out. It was supposed to come out like the day after tomorrow, or maybe tomorrow. I can't remember which one now. Day after tomorrow, I think. But we have a pandemic, and that shut down book sales, like literally completely. The printers, the Amazon's not even ordering books from printers, so printers are like, eh.
Wait, really?
So there's no print book market in existence right now.
What about Kindle?
So if you only release in an ebook, you absolutely crater what you're trying to accomplish by releasing a book.
How did Dave Rubin release his book? His book, right?
Pre-sales were big enough where the publisher, which is a big trade publisher, was able to make a good prediction on how many would go in the first sales run. So they ordered that many before things shut down, more than likely.
Okay.
So that's how they were already there for distribution beforehand. And now, because his book, blew up a while ago, and huge pre-sale numbers signal print a lot. So a lot were printed already. Our book did not fall into that category. So our publisher said it will come out post-pandemic. I think it's August, I'm making up a number, 16. It's August something, in the middle of August right now, supposing the book market exists again. So Cynical Theories was Helen Pluckrose and I, who collaborated with me, of course, on those fake papers. We wrote a book trying to trace the postmodern aspects of the roots of the critical social justice project, to explain how it is actually that postmodernism mutated. It still so this is what postmodernism is. Then it mutated in the 1990s and took up critical activism, and then that has matured into this kind of almost religious thing since roughly 2008-10 or so. And so it tracks that progress. It lays out the roots of postmodernism, how and why it turned applied in the years surrounding 1989, which is sort of like the relevant year there, and then developed into post-colonial theory, into queer theory, into critical race theory, into gender studies, fat studies, disability studies, media studies, critical pedagogy. There's probably a couple others. We don't actually touch on media studies and critical pedagogy in depth in the book. It turned out that it was too long after we covered 6 of the 9 major categories that it developed into, and we left it at 6, which are the identity-focused ones, not education, not media. So anyway, we trace that development, and then we talk about a liberal alternative that captures anything good out of all of that and says not only is that already within liberalism, but liberalism can do it better at the end. So like I said, it's available for pre-order now, so you can go pre-order it, and it will actually help quite a lot if you want to on Amazon or whatever. But it comes out sometime after the pandemic, so roughly late summer, midsummer is what we're looking at right now. Helen is recording an audiobook, and there will be ebooks and so on. It's actually coming out in hardcover also, which is kind of cool.
Awesome.
Okay.
You were going to say, Bruce?
I have one quick question. A few years back, Dr. Boghossian stated that he was taking over a project from Sam Harris. He was going to write a book of letters to a young liberal.
I think that's gone, man. I don't think that's even on the radar anymore. Maybe I should.
Really? Okay.
I'll talk to him. Maybe I'll get him to do that again. Right now, Peter is absolutely swamped with whatever in the universe he's doing now, and I'm not quite even sure what it is. We talk, pretty regularly, but we aren't really working on a ton of stuff directly together anymore. He had endeavored to pick up and write about the critical pedagogy aspect.
Okay.
Because he wants to see education get purged of this nonsense, which it's
Right.
utterly, to use their word, hegemonic throughout education theory. It owns and has owned for decades all of education theory. So he had turned his attention to that, but wasn't able to get sufficient support to be able to start working on. That would be a massive research project that he would not be able to complete without some kind of support, given his university position that he has to maintain. So not quite sure what he's doing, but Letters to a Young Liberal I don't think is on the docket, but actually it might be relevant again, and in fact more relevant now than it was. So I'll maybe bump him in that direction and see what happens.
I'm still hoping to get him on the podcast and to ask him that question myself. I know there's some work out there that's working along those lines. I think there's a book that was just released called Debunking Howard Zinn. There's
good.
a book out there, that debunks this anti-West ideology that's out there. So that should be interesting to check out.
I'll tell him to come on the show too. I'll tell him you guys are cool guys and get you on and get him on here. He's doing a lot more podcasts right now, so because of the lockdown. So he's a really social guy, and I think it's stressing him out. So he's talking to a lot more people than he used to. I'll tell him you guys are cool. And see if he won't do your show, and you can talk to him about it specifically. I will also nudge him. I think it's actually maybe a good idea now, seeing the response to Dave Rubin's book, for example. Encourages me that somebody like Peter could probably write a pretty good book that's like Letter to a Young Liberal. I actually think it would have just flopped at the time, and now I think it would probably be potentially a gold mine, because there are a lot of people, like we were discussing earlier, kind of like, what is all this crap? Mm-hmm. And Pete would actually be really good at writing a letter to young people, so I'll urge him to reconsider that idea now.
There's some momentum coming along, so it's definitely time for it to catch root.
I think so. I think that'd actually be a very good use of his time and talent too. So I'll push him in that direction.
All right. Wonderful.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining me. It's been an absolute blast to have this conversation. I hope to see all of you soon again.
Thanks. Yeah, great.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to follow me on Twitter @LeydenPhysicist, as well as on Instagram @PeleEdson2019 if you enjoyed what you watched. I try to post as often as I can. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.